Okay, well, the reason why is like, I signed this contract in 2009 that locked me into A&E Networks. Okay, and I would still love to do work with them, but like,
Rick Harrison's journey from a working-class background to becoming a household name is a testament to the resilience of the American dream. Born into a military family with few financial privileges, Rick defied the odds. In 1989, he and his father, Richard Old Man Harrison, opened gold and silver pawn shop in a humble Las Vegas neighborhood. Initially a modest survival effort, the pawn shop would soon gain prominence thanks to Rick's sharp business acumen and deep knowledge of antiques. Though Rick had no formal education, his talent as a negotiator and expert in items like Byzantine coins and Civil War firearms set him apart, ultimately making gold and silver pawn a respected name in Las Vegas's antique world. Pawn Stars. The breakthrough. Despite his increasing success, Rick's true breakthrough came in 2009, when he landed a reality television deal with the History Channel. Pawn Stars was a show that blended the mundane with the extraordinary, filming quirky transactions, offering educational tidbits about antiques, and showcasing the behind-the-scenes banter between Rick, his father, and his son, Corey. What seemed like a simple premise turned into an unexpected cultural phenomenon. The first season of Pawn Stars drew in more than 7 million viewers per episode, making it one of the most watched reality shows on television. Rick Harrison quickly became a household name. He was no longer just a pawn shop owner, he was a television personality, a symbol of self-made success, and a relatable figure to millions of Americans. Viewers were drawn to his no-nonsense attitude, his dry humor, and his ability to appraise the value of nearly any item. His persona resonated with the public. He was the everyman who had worked his way up from humble beginnings. In a world that often glorified flashy celebrities and over-the-top personalities, Rick was refreshingly down-to-earth. He was, for many, the embodiment of the American dream, a man who had taken risks, worked hard, and found success. The dark side of Rick Harrison's empire. Rick Harrison had managed to craft an image of authenticity, but like many who rise to fame, his success came with a web of hidden secrets. While his fans adored him for his affable nature, his deep knowledge of antiques, and his salt-of-the-earth demeanor, few realized the web of corruption, crime, and deceit that lay beneath the surface of gold and silver pawn. Early signs of something troubling had already emerged long before Rick's fall from grace. In fact, whispers about the origins of certain items in Rick's shop had begun circulating within the antique community. Some independent appraisers had raised concerns about the provenance of rare items, pieces that seemed to appear out of nowhere, with no clear record of ownership or legitimate source. These whispers were dismissed as nothing more than the paranoid ramblings of industry outsiders. After all, Rick had built a reputation for expertise in historical artifacts. Why question the source of items that were being sold for substantial sums? However, some of the merchandise in gold and silver pawn began to attract more scrutiny. Rare Buddhist statues from Nepal, stolen Renaissance-era icons from Italy, and ancient Greek coins with no documented history of provenance began making their way into the shop's inventory. These were valuable items, some even priceless, but they raised eyebrows. But the cameras rolled, and Rick's easygoing persona disarmed any suspicion. The show's popularity created a powerful shield around Rick and his business, one that prevented serious questions from being asked. The hidden basement. Clues to the empire's dark side. As Pawn Stars continued to thrive, Rick's empire grew. But so did the danger that came with it. Behind the scenes, something was happening in the basement of gold and silver pawn. What was once believed to be a simple storage room began to attract suspicion from various sources. A whistleblower, an employee who had worked on the show, came forward with startling claims. They revealed that Rick had a private passageway connecting his office to a restricted area beneath the pawn shop. This area was not included in any official architectural plans, and only Rick and 2 senior staff members had access to it. Packages were reportedly being delivered to the basement weekly, but the delivery records were suspiciously missing, and no one knew what was inside the packages. Even more concerning was the fact that no one was allowed to remain on the premises past 10 p.m., except for Rick himself. According to the whistleblower, on those nights, a faint light could be seen shining up through the floor vents of the building. This was something structurally impossible if the basement were merely a storage area. The FBI, which had already started looking into the suspicious activities surrounding Rick's pawn shop, began to dig deeper. They discovered that several off-site locations were linked to gold and silver pawn, including a warehouse in Henderson, an abandoned motel in northern Arizona, and an unmarked building in El Paso, Texas. All 3 were believed to be involved in cross-border smuggling operations, and all had connections to Rick's business. Further investigations revealed that gold and silver pawn was involved in money laundering, with millions of dollars in unreported cryptocurrency transactions flowing through the business. The FBI raid and the unveiling of the basement of hell. On April 15, 2025, the FBI launched a covert raid on gold and silver pawn. The operation, codenamed Hornbreaker, was swift and methodical. A tactical unit surrounded the premises at dawn, while the city of Las Vegas still slumbered under the glow of its neon lights. When the agents entered the basement, they discovered something that would leave even the most seasoned law enforcement officers speechless. What they found was far worse than anyone could have imagined. A hidden network of rooms where children were held captive. A grotesque operation tied to a transnational human trafficking network. The evidence that had been quietly gathering for months now painted a picture of unimaginable horror beneath the pawn shop. What had once been a thriving business, beloved by millions, was revealed to be a front for some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. As the full extent of the operation became clear, the world was forced to reckon with the dark truth behind Rick Harrison's empire. A man who had once been seen as the embodiment of the American dream was now exposed as the mastermind behind one of the most disturbing criminal networks in U.S. history. The public's trust in Rick Harrison had been shattered. His fall from grace was complete. The investigation that began with a few ignored emails and strange occurrences had now exposed the horrifying reality behind the pawn shop empire that had once captivated America's imagination. The discovery of the underground complex. In the early hours of April 15, 2023, the FBI's tactical unit executed a covert raid on what was once America's favorite pawn shop, Gold and Silver Pawn, owned by Rick Harrison. Beneath the store's gleaming surface, a place that had become synonymous with nostalgic Americana and quirky antiques, lay a chilling, dark secret. The basement, once thought to be a storage area for valuable artifacts and rare collectibles, was in fact an underground complex, a macabre underworld hidden away from the public eye. The FBI's raid revealed an extensive network of claustrophobic holding cells, each no larger than a few square meters. The dim, flickering industrial lighting overhead cast an eerie glow on the narrow, windowless rooms, amplifying the sense of isolation and terror within. Inside these cells were 17 children, all in various states of distress. They were severely malnourished, emaciated figures whose eyes seemed devoid of hope. Many of them were unable to speak or react, their bodies physically and mentally broken by months, in some cases years, of captivity. Some of the children were so withdrawn they could no longer recall their own names, while others exhibited signs of trauma that extended beyond the physical. Psychologists, brought in to assess the survivors, later confirmed that many of the children had been detained for extended periods, some as long as 6 months or more. Their lives had been marked by both physical and psychological torture, leaving scars that could never be erased. A criminal museum. Beneath the pawn shop alongside the human trafficking operation, the FBI's raid uncovered another layer of darkness, the hidden world of stolen artifacts. A smaller, biometrically sealed room within the basement contained a treasure trove of priceless cultural relics worth tens of millions of dollars. Among the items were Buddhist statues from Laos, lost holy paintings from French churches, medieval manuscripts, and undocumented Roman coins. These items were no longer just historical artifacts. They were evidence of a crime spree that spanned continents. All of them had been stolen and were now being trafficked under the guise of being legitimate collectibles. None of the items had proper provenance documentation, and many were listed on UNESCO's Global Stolen Artifacts Registry. It was as if the basement had become a criminal museum, an underground vault of stolen culture and tortured souls. The floor was littered with photographs, receipts, and records, each piece a fragment of a global network that had quietly and effectively evaded law enforcement for years. The items were stored with such care and precision that it was clear they had been kept for the most lucrative of buyers, the ultra-wealthy collectors who had been duped into believing they were acquiring rare and valuable pieces of history. The true origins of these artifacts were known only to a select few, the criminals who had orchestrated their theft and smuggling. The financial backbone of the operation. The financial implications of the basement operation were just as staggering as its human and cultural consequences. Analysis of the financial records linked to the operation revealed that the entire scheme was funded through opaque money flows, designed to shield the criminal activities from detection. Over $7 million had been transferred into offshore accounts over the span of 3 years, funneled through a labyrinthine web of shell companies and illicit transactions involving both antiques and cryptocurrency. Rick Harrison, it was revealed, was the registered owner of at least 3 shell companies based in Panama, Belize, and Malta. These entities, ostensibly involved in art consulting, had no legitimate staff, no officers, and no apparent business activity beyond laundering money for the criminal network. The companies were little more than paper shells used to disguise the movement of illicit funds across borders. As the investigation unfolded, the FBI coordinated with international law enforcement agencies, including Interpol Capitalism and the self-made businessman who built a reality TV empire, was now the central figure in one of the largest transnational criminal investigations in recent history. The confession that shattered the nation. As the evidence mounted, Rick Harrison's public persona began to crumble. The FBI, having pieced together his involvement in the trafficking and money laundering operations, confronted him with irrefutable proof. At first, Harrison was cooperative, but his responses were evasive. He avoided giving specifics and sought to downplay the extent of his involvement. However, under mounting pressure, Harrison's facade finally cracked. In a stunning turn of events, he chose not to retreat into silence like many other disgraced celebrities. Instead, he stood before a federal court, his face cold and expressionless, and made a chilling confession. With those words, Harrison shattered the image of the beloved TV personality that had been built up over years. Gone was the charming, affable man who had become America's favorite history teacher. Instead, he was now a defendant, standing trial for crimes that had shocked the world. His admission of guilt, however, was just the beginning of the horrors to come, the full scope of the crimes. As the trial progressed, more damning evidence came to light, painting a picture of a man who had been the mastermind behind an elaborate criminal operation. The prosecution presented a series of invoices and transaction records extracted from the basement's server, each one detailing the shipment of rare artifacts and, more chillingly, the transportation of human beings. These special lots, as they were coded, were sometimes identified as artifacts from conflict zones, but in other cases, they were children, victims of a trafficking ring that had been running under the radar for years. One of the most harrowing revelations involved Harrison's use of the dark web to auction off these special lots. The bids for these items started at $200,000, and payments were made through cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Ethereum. These funds were then laundered through shell companies and transferred to offshore accounts in countries like Belize and Malta. The operation was so sophisticated that it was nearly impossible to distinguish between the sale of stolen antiques and the sale of human beings. Rick Harrison, now facing life behind bars, did not shy away from admitting his role in the operation. In his testimony, he spoke coldly of the process by which he authenticated stolen artifacts, often from war-torn countries like Syria and Iraq. "I personally examined dozens of ancient statues," he recalled. "Many of them had blast marks from bombs, or they were shattered by explosives, but the buyers didn't care as long as they were rare." The murder of Derek Quinn. As the investigation into Harrison's operations deepened, a new twist emerged that shocked everyone involved. Derek Quinn, a former employee of Gold and Silver Pawn, had been preparing to blow the whistle on Harrison's illicit activities. Derek had worked in the pawn shop's financial department, overseeing the underground payment system that was used to launder money. After being dismissed for violating internal regulations, Derek had begun reaching out to lawyers and the media, hoping to expose the network he had been a part of. He had even been scheduled to file an official complaint just a week before his death, but Derek would never make it to court. One morning, he was found dead in his car near Henderson Airport, a single bullet wound to his temple. The circumstances surrounding his death appeared to be a textbook case of suicide. There were no signs of struggle, and the gun was found in his right hand. However, a closer examination of the autopsy report raised several red flags. The trajectory of the bullet did not align with a self-inflicted wound, and there were no fingerprints on the weapon. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras showed an unknown figure approaching Derek's car shortly before the system was disabled. The FBI quickly realized that Derek's death was not a suicide. It was a murder, carefully orchestrated to silence him before he could expose the truth. Rick Harrison, when confronted with the mounting evidence, did not deny his role in Derek's death. Under the weight of the evidence and the pressure from his attorneys, he finally confessed to orchestrating the murder. In court, he coldly declared, "If I lived, everything would collapse. I couldn't let that happen." The murder conspiracy. A calculated execution. Rick Harrison's confession to orchestrating the murder of Derek Quinn was chilling in its detail, revealing not just the depths of his criminal empire, but also his cold, calculated nature. The confession would eventually be broadcast to millions, as a haunting reminder that even the most beloved public figures could hide horrifying secrets. Rick, a man who once stood as an emblem of the American dream, a success story built on knowledge, history, and a friendly smile, was now unmasked as a criminal mastermind, willing to go to any lengths to protect his empire. Rick admitted, under the harsh spotlight of his trial, to hiring a professional hitman to eliminate Derek Quinn, a former employee at his pawn shop who had threatened to expose the network Rick had carefully constructed over the years. Derek, who had worked for the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop from 2017 to 2022, was in possession of damning evidence detailing the flow of money, the trafficking routes, and the smuggling of illicit goods that Rick had been managing for years. Derek had tried, unsuccessfully, to seek help from lawyers and the media. In fact, just 1 week before he was scheduled to file an official complaint that would have exposed the entire operation, Derek Quinn was found dead in his car near Henderson Airport, with a single bullet wound to his temple. Initially, local authorities were quick to label the death as a suicide. The gun was found in Derek's right hand, the car doors were locked from the inside, and there was no sign of struggle. But FBI investigators, who were already surveilling Rick Harrison as part of their larger probe, quickly flagged the inconsistencies in the case. The trajectory of the bullet did not match that of a self-inflicted wound. Additionally, the autopsy report was suspiciously clean, and surveillance footage captured the shadowy figure of an unknown individual approaching Derek's vehicle just before the cameras were mysteriously disabled. The confession that shocked the nation. During the trial, the confession Rick delivered became the key piece of evidence against him. The courtroom was stunned into silence as Rick's own voice echoed across the hall, captured from an audio file hidden in his phone. The recording was an incriminating conversation between Rick and the intermediary who had arranged Derek's murder. "If he talks, everything turns to ashes. Take care of it. Clean," Rick had ordered, a line that struck like a dagger to the heart of the case. His callous disregard for human life was evident in those few words. He wasn't just worried about losing money or reputation, he was willing to eliminate anyone who threatened to bring down his carefully constructed world of crime. The recording was played repeatedly in court, and each time, the gravity of its content settled deeper into the minds of the jury and the public. It became clear that Rick Harrison was not the victim of manipulation, as his defense team had tried to argue. He was the mastermind, the orchestrator of a system that spanned continents, a man who had built an empire not just on antiquities, but on human misery, trafficking, and murder. His own words and actions contradicted everything his lawyers had hoped to defend. Even more damning was the revelation that this was not the only murder plot Rick had considered. FBI agents uncovered additional plans, detailed documents, and comprehensive evidence outlining 2 other individuals Rick had marked for death. One, an antiquities broker who had threatened to expose the illicit nature of Rick's operations, and the other, a former senior staff member who had learned too much and been fired for asking questions. These plots were more than just theoretical. They were carefully mapped out, with timelines, contingency plans, and media strategies to manage the fallout. The dark reality of human commodification. Perhaps the most gut-wrenching part of Rick's confession was his admission regarding the commodification of human beings. In an act of cold, unapologetic detachment, Rick stated, "I once bought a girl for $100. She was from the Philippines. I never knew her real name in the system. She was just Special Lot 4. Those words, spoken with chilling nonchalance, resonated far beyond the courtroom. It was as if the world had stopped spinning in that moment, and the audience watching could hardly comprehend the magnitude of what they had just heard. A life had been reduced to a mere commodity, a piece of inventory. The line sounded like something ripped from the pages of a dystopian thriller, but it was all too real. Rick's admission revealed not just his participation in child trafficking, but his role in the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children for profit. These children were no longer viewed as individuals with their own stories, hopes, and identities.
A sword
They were
used for
simply
beheading Christians.
lots with prices attached, just like the ancient artifacts Rick had so skillfully sold.
Beheading Christians.
For years,
Okay.
Rick
Can we
had
see the
built his
blade on
public
this thing?
persona
Do you
on
mind
the
if I take it
premise
apart?
of being
Absolutely.
a fatherly figure,
Please.
someone who loved history, who admired culture, and who had a special appreciation for the value of knowledge. His viewers had believed that he represented the best of American values: honesty, hard work, and curiosity. But in his confession, Rick stripped away that facade, revealing the twisted reality of a man who had become consumed by greed and power. He was no longer just the host of Pawn Stars, he was a man who had chosen to exploit human suffering for profit. The fallout, from national idol to public enemy. The public's reaction to Rick Harrison's confession was swift, overwhelming, and deeply unsettling. Within hours of the broadcast, social media platforms were ablaze with outrage. Twitter exploded with hashtags like #NotMyPawnStar and #WhatRickTheMonster, which accumulated millions of mentions in a matter of days. TikTok videos that juxtaposed clips of Rick's jovial demeanor on the show with harrowing excerpts from his confession went viral, garnering millions of views. What had once been a beloved television show, a source of comfort and nostalgia for millions of viewers, now became a symbol of betrayal. Rick Harrison, once affectionately referred to as America's Dad, was now known as the Basement Monster and the Child Seller. His carefully crafted public persona had been shattered beyond repair. The scandal spread beyond the digital realm and permeated into traditional media outlets. Networks like CNN, BBC, and the New York Times quickly launched in-depth investigations into the case, with legal experts, human rights advocates, and psychologists providing commentary on the shocking revelations. For many, the Rick Harrison scandal became a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust in reality television and celebrity culture. It forced the public to ask uncomfortable questions. How much of what we see on screen is real? How many more Ricks are there, hiding behind smiles and cameras, running criminal operations in the shadows? The impact on the pawn industry and broader culture. The fallout was not limited to Rick Harrison's personal reputation. The pawn industry, once buoyed by the popularity of Pawn Stars, experienced a sharp decline in customer interest. Within 2 weeks of the confession, pawn shops in major cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago reported a staggering 40% drop in foot traffic. The National Pawnbrokers Association, INPA, issued an urgent statement distancing the profession from Rick's criminal actions, but the damage had already been done. For many, the connection between Rick's criminal enterprise and the pawn industry was inescapable. Sponsors and brands that had once been associated with Rick Harrison also severed ties quickly. A major automobile company, which had partnered with Rick for his mobile tour, immediately pulled out of the agreement. Insurance brands, streaming platforms, and even the History Channel itself, the home of Pawn Stars, faced intense backlash. The History Channel suspended Pawn Stars indefinitely while it reviewed its production oversight protocols. One of the most significant outcomes of the scandal was the rise of a movement demanding greater transparency in the reality television industry. Advocacy groups began calling for government investigations into the role of media in enabling criminal behavior, especially when it involved business ventures masquerading as entertainment. The public's collective faith in the authenticity of reality television had been shattered, and the ripple effects were felt far and wide. The courtroom battle. The end of an era. As the trial unfolded, it became evident that Rick Harrison's legal team was fighting an uphill battle. Despite their efforts to frame him as a victim of a much larger criminal network, the evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. The defense's narrative that Rick was a mere pawn in a larger game crashed under the weight of the 1,100 pages of evidence, including invoices, geolocation data, and testimonies from survivors of his trafficking operation. Rick's downfall was not just personal. It symbolized a much deeper societal issue: how easily we could be deceived by the images we see on television, and how those images can be used to conceal the darkest of truths. The case against Rick Harrison was no longer just a criminal trial. It was a wake-up call, forcing America to confront the realities behind the facades of its beloved celebrities. As the prosecution closed its case, Rick Harrison stood at the center of a media storm, his legacy irreparably tainted. The public may never be able to fully understand the depths of his betrayal, but one thing was clear. Rick Harrison's confession had forced America to reckon with a truth far more disturbing than anything television could have ever shown.